Officer for Indegene. In my role as the CTO, I get to look at a lot of different technologies, look at the state of the art of these technologies, and explore different use cases with our enterprise customers. And today we want to talk about a few of those different technologies and the state of the art for those. So we'll begin with just a few different high-profile technologies: blockchain, metaverse, and natural language models. And if we go to the next slide, please. And for each of these, the state of the art are rapidly evolving. And when that happens, the use cases and how they can be used, those evolve quite quickly. And there tends to be some confusion about what's practical today versus what's upcoming, and just keeping track of those. So what we'll try to do is take advantage of some of the experiences we've gained from working with our customers and as well as looking at other industries, and see how we can apply them to life sciences today. If we go to the next slide. So let's begin with blockchain. Many of us may be familiar with blockchain from the concept of cryptocurrency, maybe Bitcoin or Ethereum, and at least have a high-level view that what a blockchain is literally a network of blocks. So you have blocks of information that are connected to each other, and these blocks have a lot of different cryptographic controls and security attached to them so that they cannot be altered. They can be trusted and verified. That's kind of at the heart of what a blockchain is. But more than that, it has a couple of other properties attached to it which make it quite interesting and unlock some use cases for us. If we go to the next slide, please. So at its core, a blockchain is a distributed append-only ledger of provably signed, sequentially linked, and cryptographically secured transactions. And this ledger is replicated across a network of computer nodes. And these different computer nodes have ongoing updates to the ledger that are determined through a software-driven consensus. So that's kind of a large statement to basically say that I have a trusted ledger where the transactions that are added to the ledger have gone through a process to make sure that there's trust and that these are valid, and that the way we determine that validity is through something called consensus. And maybe you've heard of these terms of proof of work or proof of stake. These are different algorithms for that consensus. Maybe you're familiar with what Ethereum just went through, where they've kind of moved from a proof of work type of a consensus, which is a very computationally intensive type of a system, to proof of stake, which is substantially less computer intensive. So it makes a big impact in terms of energy consumption. That's just one example, but there are different algorithms for how we determine this consensus. But that's one of the powerful attributes of a blockchain, is being able to have that kind of a model to trust the records that are in there. So immutable, meaning that it's unalterable. Distributed, which is distinct from decentralized, but both are properties, potential properties of blockchains, and this consensus mechanism I just talked about. So we go to the next slide, please. So beyond that, blockchains also come in a variety of flavors. There are these public blockchains, which are these high profile, especially these different coins that are out there. So Bitcoin is the most famous example. These are ones where anybody can join the network, and everybody has equal rights. You can participate in the validation of records. You can be anonymous in these environments. So these are called public. They're also referred to as permissionless type of blockchains. There are also private blockchains, and some call these permissioned blockchains. And so here, there actually tends to be some sort of authority who can control who has access to the network, who's a member of the network, even their role within the network, and even have some control over how the consensus is achieved with the network. And so while that sounds a bit contrary to what the core philosophy of a blockchain is in terms of pure decentralization, it does offer some advantages especially in the enterprise space. So, for example, here you're not anonymous. You have an identity. There is a trust that's established among the partners of this network, and the computation speed and the transaction rates within these private blockchains is much higher than in the public one. So, in an enterprise setting, being able to have some of those controls is actually important. You don't want to have your supply chain, for example, open on a public network. There are reasons to put that within some sort of private construct, and that's what these permissioned or private blockchains allow us to do. And there are also categories of blockchains that kind of fuse properties of both, where you have some of the aspects of a public blockchain combined with the aspects of private. So, an example is what we call consortium, where you have, rather than a single authority who's managing the access to the network and their roles, you actually have a small group of participants who administer the network. So it's no one single party, it's a collection of pre identified parties who are owners, or the consortium that controls the network. So we have a variety of different types of operating models, but at the heart of it are those properties we talked about earlier. It's immutable, it's distributed, it's consensus based. If you go to the next slide. These blockchains also have this concept of, and I think, sorry, I think we skipped one slide. If you can go back one. Yes. So the blockchain will have this property of that's called smart contracts, and this is a very powerful and probably one of the biggest enablers for use cases with using blockchains in the enterprise setting, but also in the general consumer setting. So what smart contracts are basically programs that are stored on the blockchain and that execute when certain predefined conditions are met. And the advantage of smart contracts are that once they're agreed upon and stored on the blockchain, they cannot be altered. They can be basically signed, they're trusted, just like data that's stored in the blockchain. These contracts, these bits of code, cannot be altered. These smart contracts can also have agreed upon the terms of a contract. They're codified into basically a snippet of code that gets stored onto the blockchain. Once the events that are determined to trigger the contract happen, they're guaranteed to execute. So the smart contracts guarantee execution of the contract, and the output of the smart contract goes back into the blockchain. So these are automated, they're self executing agreements. They're trustworthy, just like data that's stored in the blockchain. They have the same properties on there. They provide a lot of transparency around the terms and the variables of the contract, and they provide the traceability of transactions, and they're also irreversible. So they have a lot of benefits in terms of being able to execute business processes and using the blockchain at the back end. So the combination of all these properties of blockchains, the immutability, the distributed distribution, the signatures, the cryptographically secure transactions, as well as these smart contracts, those give us a lot of ammunition to start building various use cases in applications on top of the blockchain. And today, the state of the art of where we're at in blockchains, the adoption of it across industry has been increasing. The different types of algorithms used for consensus have been improving and becoming more practical for typical computer nodes. You don't need any sort of giant GPU farm to run enterprise use cases. So we see a lot of benefits and a lot of opportunity to leverage this type of technology in enterprise life science use cases. If we go to the next slide. So one interesting application of the blockchain backend is how does it actually materialize on the front end? So there is a concept of what some people call it DApps, some people call it DApps, and these are basically distributed applications. And these are basically software that is consumer facing or front end facing, where it's built upon the blockchain technology in the back end. So they're fundamentally a distributed application at its heart. And so these are very interesting because it allows us now to actually build front end experiences on top of this distributed and decentralized blockchain technology in the back end. And this screenshot you see here is an example from one called Health Blocks. This is built on top of a private blockchain called IoTex, and it's around patient data ownership. It allows patients to take ownership of their data in a blockchain environment. If we go to the next slide. Now, blockchain has certainly been around a little while. Enterprise use cases for this have been around, and we've seen that the number of not only pilots and experiments, but even starting to graduate into real scalable use cases has been happening. This is a recent report from Block Data, and if you look across the different logos in there, you'll see quite a few of our enterprise pharma customers are listed in here as well. The bulk of the different platforms being used are private enterprise blockchains. And most of these use cases are tied to different supply chain type of scenarios, but there are a few exceptions to that. But the point being here is that we're actually seeing utilization of blockchain within the enterprise pharma context happening. It's early days for some folks, and identifying the right use cases and opportunities has been one of the areas of growth now that these technologies are becoming more and more accepted. If we can go to the next slide. There are a few other examples of how blockchain are being used. As I mentioned, that supply chain tends to be the most immediate and obvious use case, and we see that not only in pharma, but we see that in many, many different industries, that supply chain and record keeping, and especially when you have a federated environment of partners, that the blockchain actually offers a lot of advantages. But there are a few others, and if you look at the right hand side here, there's a few logos you may recognize. We have block data that's in the drug traceability side of things, or sorry, block pharma. KitChain was actually formed by a collaboration between a whole group of different enterprise pharma partners and a technology company, and that's also in the clinical supply chain side of things. The pharma ledger is again in the supply chain side of things. They're more focused on clinical trials and patient data. Patientory is an interesting company in New York based. They are on the patient side of things, so allow patients to take ownership and control of their data, and they're actually unlocking a couple of use cases in clinical trial recruitment, and they're starting to get into more enterprise scenarios as well. Emblema is in the bioinformatics side of things, so real world data and regulatory submissions. MediLedger is in the supply chain side of things. They're trying to build a platform where you can build other use cases on top of it. And ProCredX is actually in the credentialing side of things. So verification and credentialing is what they're actually leveraging the blockchain for. And this is just a sampling. There are many other companies. Some are startups, some are a little bit more mature, but all capitalizing on the properties of blockchains that we talked about. The bulk of these are built on top of private or a type of hybrid consortium-based blockchain. They're not really based upon public at this point. Go to the next slide. So there's a very other interesting attribute of blockchain, and this is what we think is going forward. Maybe you're familiar with some of these terms on the internet between Web 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And today we're living in what many people coin as the Web 2.0 world, and we have a vision going towards Web 3.0. So what these different terms really are referring to are these evolutionary steps in how we engage online and what applications are like online. In Web 1.0 world, when we first started building websites, they tend to be very static. They were basically static pages, not very interactive, not very dynamic. And we evolved into what we're working with today, Web 2.0, which are a lot of user-generated content. There's sharing of content across different partners. It's dynamic. There's interactive elements within there. And the data involved in the Web 2.0 world tend to be very centralized. And I think a lot of us see in the news all these concerns as these large tech companies, Amazons, Googles, and Apples of the world are more and more collecting and owning our data. And there's a growing kind of pushback, right, saying that how these companies are monetizing and using our data are causing issues around privacy and more than that, actually, they're just drawing a lot of concern. And so there's this idea of the next generation of the internet, Web 3.0, which some call it the semantic web, which means basically that all the content on the web tends to be tagged and marked up so that computers can understand it, and bots can do search more effectively. But a hallmark of Web 3.0 is a decentralized infrastructure. They want to start bringing the data back into your control. Your data is something that you own. And a lot of the push has been this Web 3.0 world should be based upon a blockchain type of infrastructure. So that's an interesting application of blockchain that we see coming up rapidly going forward. And it seems that this will be another major inflection point in our usage of our online resources, whether that inflection point is something happens overnight or whether someone flips a switch and you've got Web 3.0. But the direction is certainly headed there. We definitely see all the vectors pointing towards this kind of a model where you start to own your data. It's more decentralized, and you have different types of experiences that are unlocked from it. One other part of Web 3.0 is by having this kind of a new data ecosystem, they also want to bring in more immersive experiences. And so blockchain could be at the core of these next generation immersive experiences. So our next network of a globally connected network could be actually based on blockchain with smart contracts that are actually powering it behind the scenes. So when we talked about those dApps earlier, we can imagine Web 3.0 actually being a collection of dApps that follow standards. Web 3.0 defined about standards of interoperability, so we can actually get around from dApp to dApp, just like we can click links and go from website to website today. So we believe that as you get into patient facing or HCP facing or any sort of interaction with our customers in an online way in our digital touch points, that being prepared and thinking about Web 3.0 experiences, thinking about how dApps can fit into there, that's kind of the direction things are going. So next slide, please. So coupled with this Web 3.0 and this idea of increased immersion, this is where Metaverse comes in. And so there's, again, a lot of hype and noise around Metaverse, and rightfully so. The amount of investment that's happening across the industry, across different hardware companies, software companies, data companies, everybody's thinking about Metaverse, and certainly the dollar spent in there is unprecedented. But we also need to kind of be realistic about Metaverse. Today, Metaverse does not exist. We think we're getting there, just like with Web 3.0, which I think is part of Metaverse is part of the Web 3.0 concept. That we're not there yet today, but the vector is certainly pointing in that direction. There's a gentleman by the name of Tony Parisi who's considered one of the early thought leaders of Metaverse. Actually, he's one of the pioneers of virtual reality markup language. He was had a senior role at Unity, and today he's a chief strategy officer at a very high-profile Metaverse startup. And he coined kind of 7 key attributes. At broad brushstrokes, this is a single metaverse. So it's not like we have multiple metaverses. There will be one metaverse that is the collection of all these different, whether you want to call them worlds or spaces, or there's different terms people are tossing around, but there's a single metaverse that connects all of these different environments together. The metaverse should support all use cases. This is not a gaming platform. It's not a currency platform. This is a platform meant to support all different use cases, all different demographics of users, all different ethnographics of users, all different use cases within there. This is so it's meant to be very open in that sense. Number 3, nobody controls the metaverse. As we talked about earlier, this growing push towards decentralization of our data, that certainly is part of it. But also, if you want to really scale up the metaverse, you want to scale up this network environment with a variety of use cases, you need to give the power to allow people to explore and create new use cases and applications. And if you have a single entity or a limited number of entities that control it, then what we could do with the metaverse becomes controlled. So a key rule for him is that nobody should control it. We need to be able to have a foundation that anybody can build on top of. Metaverse should be open. So this is one of the reasons why I was saying that the metaverse doesn't exist today. We don't yet have universally agreed upon interoperability standards. So the ability to click a link and jump from place to place isn't really there today, right? You can do it within one application, but if I wanted to jump from one application to another one, the same way I can click a hyperlink and go from one website to another one, we don't have that yet today. And that's just one example of the openness that we need. We need interoperability standards that are open, that allow us to make those kinds of connections. Metaverse is also hardware independent. So metaverse is a concept. Most of us think about using these type of goggles when we get into the metaverse space, but that's not necessarily the case, right? We don't know what kind of hardware would be available tomorrow, and we're hoping they're much more friendly than what we have today. So we can certainly imagine that if we're going into a 3D experience, we'd like to have glasses that are much more comfortable, or maybe someday someone will come up with an approach to completely eliminate glasses. We also should be able to get into metaverse experiences with any other device, whether it's our mobile phone, our desktops, laptops, or something new that may come tomorrow. Metaverse is more about the overall interoperability around these experiences, not necessarily the hardware part of it. Now, it is true that uh, most of these immersive experiences will probably end up being some form of a 3D extended reality experience, but we're not arguing that the metaverse should be solely locked into that. And the metaverse is a network, just like our internet is today. And that kind of ties into the seventh point. The metaverse basically is the internet. We actually see this as the next global connected network. So the reason it was important to kind of spend time looking at these seven attributes is that we think a lot about how we engage with our customers, whether it's HCPs on the commercial side with patients and patient support programs, or other enterprise and non-enterprise customers. And as we are arguing about more and more digital experiences, how those experiences get materialized, and are we meeting the expectations and the kind of experiences that people expect, this certainly feeds into it. So today we're very early days in this metaverse concept. The standards don't exist yet; they're being worked on by various standard bodies. But certainly we will see rapid evolution over the coming months and years as the expected digital experience for patients, for professionals, for the world changes. And so, thinking about our content development processes, thinking about how we manage content, how we syndicate content, think of how we build our applications and start thinking about these dApps, those will feed into the Web 3.0 and the metaverse experiences later on. If you go to the next slide, please. Whatever your feelings are about Zuckerberg and Facebook slash Meta, at least the vision he's put out there in terms of what the metaverse is, something that we think makes a lot of sense. And he's talking about those interoperable, having standards for that. That certainly is an important attribute. And having these open interoperability standards are key features to unlocking metaverse use cases. And we think those are coming very soon. There are serious large scale efforts today with a variety of different bodies that are contributing and helping to define those standards. And you're starting to see those get materialized in new platforms as they're emerging. So if you're not keeping on top of the different metaverse platforms and standards that are coming out, and you're in a role where you need to start thinking about digital touch points and engagement, it might be worth keeping a tab or keeping track of some of those evolutions. Go to the next slide, please. I had mentioned that the hardware independence of the metaverse. There's this term, extended reality, that gets used, and if you're not familiar with it, extended reality is kind of an umbrella term that encompasses three forms of immersive experiences. We have virtual reality, which is something like this Oculus Quest 2 does, where basically it's a completely virtual digital world when you put on the headset and headphones. Then we have this concept of augmented reality, where you're basically are looking at the real world and you get some overlays. So the computer can be able to recognize certain objects and can overlay information. So facial recognition is a good example. You're walking down the street, you see somebody's face, and you get a little tooltip on the sign that has their name and maybe some of your CRM data or background about them is possible. And then there's mixed reality, where you have, again, looking at the real world, and you have digital objects that are overlaid, but these digital objects can actually interact with the real world. So you actually have more advanced forms of machine vision that can actually combine the virtual world and the real world in a more sophisticated way. So there's actually interaction between the two. So these three types of immersive experiences all go under the umbrella term XR. And what we're seeing in terms of the not only the evolution of hardware, but the evolution of software, is that each of these is evolving and the state of the art is improving at a really accelerated pace. Matter of fact, today, from a consumer perspective, on the virtual reality side, the Oculus Quest 2 is probably the most budget-wise, easiest to get, and most consumer-friendly. But it's already now becoming obsolete. We're expecting to see the next generation of hardware come out in October of this year, and we also, between now and even by spring of next year, we've heard announcements and have seen examples of massive changes in the hardware, both on the augmented reality and the virtual reality side. So we're even within the next, let's say, 12 months, the kind of experiences, the immersive experiences that can be made available to patients and to professionals will be rapidly evolving. If we go to the next slide. There's a number of different use cases that we've seen, and we've seen pilots, we've seen programs that are not only experiments, but even some kind of small scale and some mid-sized scale events that are using these different use cases where we're taking advantage of some of the concepts of metaverse, and still within a constrained boundary, since we don't have a true metaverse. And most of these tend to be virtual reality experiences. Patient networks, patients can come in and have a different type of social engagement, to the ability to actually literally walk down hallways or go into rooms and meet people in a more immersive way, and to get access to educational and informational content that's in a more immersive experience. That we've seen a wide variety of those, and we think those use cases are going to continue to expand and get easier to develop as this technology evolves. Telemedicine, even in hybrid clinical trials, remote diagnostics, digital therapeutics. We've seen a lot of opportunities with this type of hardware in telemedicine, even in terms of doctor visits and consults. Right, today it's not uncommon to have a doctor visit over Zoom. We're seeing people test use cases where those doctor visits happen in a more immersive 3D environment, and I've seen that in some cases, there are benefits to doing it that way compared to the more flat video conferencing type of a model. Training and simulations. This is probably the most heavily done today. So we see a lot of use cases around training and education, especially in device type simulations. These types of immersive experiences work very well for that. So as the hardware and software gets easier and more powerful, these experiences will become richer. So we see a lot of use cases there in healthcare. If we go to the next slide, please. On the enterprise side, HCP, so basically allowing reps to engage through these novel digital channels. We see metaverse and these types of immersive experiences as part of an overall omnichannel strategy. It's certainly not a replacement for it, but today we think about omnichannel engaging through a dozen types of mediums, from email and text and different types of social channels. We think that these types of metaverse or immersive experiences will be added into that mix. So certain types of engagement activities will be done with these devices, and they'll be done more frequently. And as the technology evolves, we'll be able to leverage the data from these experiences. This, very similar way that we were able to leverage our touch points with events and marketing certain launch events. This is already being done in other industries, and sometimes in a very high profile way. And we think in our enterprise pharma space, more and more of these types of events will be done in a not exclusively in a metaverse or an immersive experience, but the platform of choice should one that allow people to attend these events through traditional channels, maybe through their iPads or desktops, but they could also choose to join through these types of 3D experiences and get a more immersive experience of the event. And the two are fused together. Right? You don't have to build both. There'll be the single platform that unites the two. If we go to the next slide. And then lastly, the educational use cases. We've already seen a number of experiences around medical congresses, patient simulation, and immersive learning. The patient simulation is an interesting one because there's this concept of digital twins, where your presence, your avatar within the metaverse environment you can actually construct a twin of yourself or of a patient that has all the properties and the description of a real individual, and then have those digital twins go through these types of patient simulation experiments. So what happens if we go through a standard clinical process from collecting their medical history and then doing a differential diagnosis, lab tests, treatment, seeing outcomes? Digital twins can actually simulate that whole experience through these types of simulations. So that's a very interesting use case. I think we're going to see more and more of these over time. Next slide, please. So that said, there's a lot of interesting opportunities, and it's certainly exciting to be able to bring this new channel to the omni-channel mix. But that said, as we said, the metaverse doesn't exist today, and these standards have to be put in place to really have a true metaverse. And with these standards in place, not only will make it more interoperable and easier for us to launch these events, but the cost of developing these events would also go dramatically down. Once standards are in place, then the tools come into place to use them. And in an open environment with open standards, then competition among tools and evolution of tools happens at a much higher pace. So it's very important that these agreements around the metaverse, these standards happen. And the good news is that we actually see this being done at a large scale. The logos you see at the bottom of the slide, these are some of the high profile names, and it's a very small subset of the partners within the metaverse standards community. So there actually is a body now that's comprised of, I think, well over 600 partners, a few of which are listed here, who are thinking through these standards and who ultimately will help to adopt and make them real. Some of the things that have to be thought about are what are in these boxes. So unlike the web today, where we just think about hyperlinks and a few other types of attributes, in the metaverse space, we have an identity and we have objects and possessions. So standards around you think about your virtual goods and your virtual backpack that contains the goods, and your own persona as you go from place to place. If you've used any of these devices today, maybe you use something like Ready Player Me or something to create your avatar and your outfits and your look, and maybe you've created some custom objects for yourself. How do you take those objects with you from one application to another one? And when you go from one place to another one, do those things behave the same? You imagine a virtual stethoscope, for example. If I had a stethoscope in a certain virtual hospital, and then I go from that hospital to some other environment, does that virtual stethoscope still exist? Does it still work the same? Those kinds of interoperability standards are what this committee is thinking through, beyond just the ability to teleport from place to place. Yeah, but these are happening, and we're expecting to see that these standards get ratified and matured and starting to materialize in the platforms. And we're already seeing a variety of metaverse platforms that are designed to start consuming these standards as they become more well defined. Go to the next slide. So there are a couple approaches to actually using this technology today. What we've been advocating is that it's a good time to do pilots and experiments, but maybe not the best time to go in a overly aggressive investment in terms of trying to build completely new environments that are highly interactive, but ones that require something that complicated. The odds are it'll become obsolete real quick, right? Once the standards get evolved, there's no guarantee that what we build today will follow the standards. So it's better to take advantage of platforms that are available off the shelf that have some of the key features we want in there, and find ways to repurpose existing content into those spaces and start running those experiments, those pilots, and start seeing which type of experiences draw interest from your customers. For example, setting up patient programs, there are certain type of experiences. How do you invite patients to the environment? Once they're there, how do you capture their interest? How do you collect in data about their questions and the kind of answers they're looking for? So those kind of experiments can be run today. And so we've been advocating a model where, using standard platforms that are available off the shelf today, figure out ways to actually take your existing content that you're using in maybe the 2D world and bring them into these immersive environments in novel and interesting ways, but focus more around the experience. If I'm bringing someone into there, do I make an experience that for them it was worth the friction of getting into this space? And as that friction reduces, more and more people will come, but at least you can start getting some of that data today. And so that's what the short-term activation of metaverse from our point of view looks like. And if we go to the next slide, over the long term, being able to go in and start seeing, okay, who are those winning platforms, right? Is it what Meta is doing? Is it what Microsoft is doing? Is it somebody new? Tony Parisi, I mentioned earlier, is Chief Strategy Officer for Lamina One, which is created by a couple of very high-profile names. The guy who created the term metaverse is one of the founders of that platform. And so they're trying to create a new plan. So maybe they'll become the same. We don't know, right? And so as this becomes more transparent over time, and as we start to see the winning standards and the winning platforms to build on, then we think from an enterprise perspective, it's good to start partnering up with some of these players who give us the best tools, who follow the standards in a better way to actually build out our patient and professional experiences in the metaverse. So this is, in our point of view, this is more of a mid to long term in terms of building out those custom fit for purpose experiences. And in the short term, we're focused more on repurposing what we have today into metaverse immersive experiences. So that's metaverse, and certainly there's a lot more to be said. But for now, let's pivot into large language models, and that seems like a huge jump in concept. But actually, the reason that we added it to today's presentation was because we just talked about experiences, and ultimately, it's about how we as people connect with computers and the digital world. And what we see is NLP, natural language processing, is becoming the primary mechanism for how humans will interact with computers, and conversely, how computers understand humans. And so we're seeing that the state of the art in natural language processing has been moving so rapidly and getting so much better that at a fundamental level, how we as people engage with and use computers is changing. And the use cases on which we create these digital experiences, those will be rapidly evolving. There are a wide variety of use cases that are used in natural language processing, de-identifying protected health information, extraction of clinical data from journal articles and other unstructured sources. On the enterprise side, document management, document search and discovery. There are processes to bring intelligence into document authoring, as well as document analysis. And we also see in the broader universe, AI-assisted bots to go and answer questions across a variety of different sources. The natural language processing at the heart of it is critical. For the next slide, please. In the large language, in natural language processing space, there's a technology called transformers, and this has been the primary driver behind the state of the art. And transformers are basically it's a neural network that is, and if you're not familiar with the term, it's basically a form of artificial intelligence. And the transformer is a particular type of an algorithm that represents the current state of the art. And the big advantage that transformers have is that they're able to understand context better than other algorithms. So in this example sentence you see on the screen, in a transformer, the relationship between the word making and more efficient, transformer models are much better at figuring out that there's a dependency between the word making and more efficient, even though there's a large distance separating those two phrases. And so when you have these large distances in place, which represents real world language, transformers are far more efficient and better at identifying those relationships across distance than most other algorithms are. So that's one of the big advantages that transformers have, and that's what most companies who are investing in natural language processing are taking advantage of. In the transformer model, there's this concept of parameters, which are basically fine-tuning knobs that we can twist and turn in order to get the output of the algorithm much better, right? So there's certainly a huge amount of science and mathematics behind it, which we won't go into here, but generally speaking, the larger the number of parameters, then the more advanced we consider the NLP system, and certainly its ability to understand context becomes improved. Now, that said, as you can imagine, the larger the number of parameters, more computationally intensive it is to build these models. So there are a lot of efforts going on today on how to achieve the same outcomes by with a reduced number of parameters. But broadly speaking, the number of parameters can be correlated towards how good the NLP algorithm is at understanding context from language. So if we go to the next slide. And at the beginning of this presentation, I talked about there's a rapidly evolving industry of technologies. The use cases are changing. Language models are no exception to that. What you see here is a report from Life Architect. This is just a sampling of some of the bigger large language models out there, and in the small numbers below them is actually the number of parameters they have. And you're talking about on the orders of millions to billions of parameters in each of these language models. So the size of the bubble represents the number of parameters in there. Some of these language models are available for us to use today. Some of them are held privately. So we see announcements and research papers on certain language models that have achieved a new state of the art in outcomes. A few of those are released for us to use in the industry. Some of those are kept within the creators of, for example, at Google, they have some language models which they certainly have published about in research papers, but haven't really made generally available yet. But that's changing. Even what the items that are available to us today, generally available today, are extremely advanced and actually can do a lot. And we see them changing on a month-to-month basis. Go to the next slide. But this right here in that table, you're actually seeing some of the models just since this year, from January of this year through August. You can see, and this is a sampling, this isn't even a complete list. These are some of the high profile announcements on language models. And if you look at some of these in August of this year, Microsoft 710 million parameter language model. And Meta launched a BlenderBot, 175 billion parameters. Matter of fact, if you Google BlenderBot 3, they have built a web page where it's a little robot character is there, and you can have a conversation with that robot and on any topic about anything you want to, and you'll start to experience a conversation that's tries to mimic a real human experience. And the state of the art and how good they've gotten at it is pretty impressive, right? And you can definitely see where things are going. We see other models here on the order of billions of parameters. So with these kind of models in place, we think about how can I start to use these in enterprise and in very domain specific problems. So with these large language models, as they're evolving, they're starting to unlock certain scenarios that allow us to contextualize them for use cases. And this contextualizing is something we call fine tuning. How do I take a large language model? These are typically trained using things like Wikipedia or other types of news sources. But how do I start training it to actually think about clinical information? These things have not likely been trained against PubMed, for example. But you can start training these systems to handle PubMed, and the approaches to the fine tuning it to handle clinical literature, those are becoming vastly easier to implement. So there's a few concepts. One's called few shot learning, and which ultimately leads towards zero shot learning. And what few shot learning means is that I can actually take a small collection, maybe a few dozen examples of literature and of clinical literature, give that to the machine, and the machine can actually then incrementally tweak that large language model to actually then handle clinical literature in a broad way. It doesn't need a substantial amount of investment or training. It just needs a few examples to understand the domain context. And ultimately, the most sophisticated models will actually be able to, I give it, I don't even have to give it a few examples. It'll actually just pick it up with zero shot. Basically, it can detect new categories of information without us having to ahead of time give it even those examples. We don't really have solid zero shot learning today for clinical, but we actually see that we're getting closer to it. And there are examples of few shot learning that is out there today, and especially what we've seen with Microsoft's NLP as well as the GPT systems. They're allowing us to actually do these kinds of fine tuning. So I think that the applications of domain specific language models to transform the way that our patient engagement and professional engagement with digital touchpoints, how those will change, are are rapidly evolving, and we'll see over the coming months and years a huge change in terms of how we actually interact with medical information, clinical information, how clinical trial touch points with patients are conducted, how commercial groups interact with HCPs on the marketing side. Those will rapidly evolve as the state of the art of language models changes. So I'll pause there, and I hope you found this information interesting. It's all three of these areas: blockchain, metaverse, and language models are evolving at a very rapid pace. So we just saw, for example, in the language models, just within August of this year itself, you could saw the number of advancements happening, and the same thing is happening in the other spaces as well. So the use cases are certainly evolving across each of these, and we actually see enterprise pharma and life sciences overall being able to take advantage of these in more compelling ways in the near, mid, and long term. So happy to take any questions, and we'll pause it there.